Hello, folks, and welcome back to Boss Economic World, the only show that cuts through the political noise to tell you what's really happening to your money. So, the big day is here. November 14th, 2025. The Great Shutdown Showdown of 25 has finally reached its season finale. After 43 excruciating days, President Trump has signed a bill, the lights are flickering back on in Washington, and the gears of the federal government are grinding back to life. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from 850,000 federal workers who can finally stop checking their savings accounts with a sense of existential dread. The official narrative? Crisis averted. Victory declared. President Trump told reporters he sent a clear message. Speaker Mike Johnson called the Democrat strategy foolish and pointless. And Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries is talking about a Republican healthcare crisis. It's a whole lot of victory laps for a race where everyone seems to have tripped over their own feet and faceplanted just before the finish line. So, today, we're going to do what we always do, pull back the curtain on the political theater. We'll look at the real economic price tag of this 43-day fiasco, who actually paid it, and why this supposed ending is really just the intermission in a play that's about to get a whole lot more expensive. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about the bill. Not the one Trump signed, but the one you, me, and the entire US economy are stuck with. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, think of them as the official accountants for Congress who are perpetually tired of their boss's spending habits, put out a projection. They estimated that this little 43-day impasse would slash our real gross domestic product growth for this quarter by 1.5 percentage points. Now, 1.5% might not sound like a lot. It's the kind of number that makes most people's eyes glaze over. So let me put it in boss terms for you. The US economy is a behemoth, a nearly $30 trillion a year machine. For this final quarter of 2025, we were looking at a GDP of around $7.5 trillion. A $1.5112 billion. $112 billion. Gone. Poof. Vanished into the thin air of political stubbornness. To give you some perspective, that's more than the entire annual GDP of a country like Ecuador. It's enough to fund NASA for 4 years. We could have given every single man, woman, and child in America a check for $330. Instead, we lit that pile of money on fire to settle a political argument. Now, the CBO, in its infinite optimism, says about half of that might be recouped next year. How? Because federal workers will get back pay, and government contractors will restart their work. Let me be crystal clear, this is an accounting fantasy. It's like saying if you cancel your family's vacation, you recoup the money by staying home and ordering pizza. You didn't recoup anything. You just missed the vacation. Think about the real-world losses. The national parks that were closed? All that tourism revenue from entrance fees, local hotels, and diners in gateway towns like Gatlinburg, Tennessee, or Moab, Utah? That's gone forever. The small business owner with a federal contract to provide IT services who had to lay off his staff? He can't just magically recoup the 2 mortgage payments he missed. The foreign investor who saw the US government literally close up shop and decided to invest in a more stable market in Germany or Singapore instead? That capital isn't coming back next quarter. This recouping idea ignores the catastrophic loss of productivity, momentum, and confidence. It's the ultimate example of looking at a spreadsheet instead of the real world. The real cost is permanent. But as we always say here, the economy isn't just numbers on a screen. It's people. And this is where the real story of the shutdown gets ugly. Let's start with the 850,000 federal workers. For 43 days, these folks were either furloughed, told to stay home without pay, or deemed essential and forced to work without a paycheck. Think about that. Air traffic controllers, responsible for thousands of lives every hour, were landing planes while wondering how they were going to pay for their kids' daycare. TSA agents were screening for threats at the airport while getting threatening letters from their landlords. We're told they'll get back pay, and it's expected to start hitting accounts on Saturday. Fantastic. But back pay doesn't cover the late fees on your credit card. It doesn't undo the stress of telling your child you can't afford their school trip. It doesn't pay back the high-interest payday loan you had to take out just to buy groceries. This isn't a bonus, it's a deeply insulting apology for holding your livelihood hostage. Then there's the ripple effect. Let's talk about food. The article mentions the 42 million Americans on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, what we used to call food stamps. For weeks, their November benefits were held in legal limbo. Now that a deal is done, you'd think they just flip a switch, right? Wrong. State agencies have to update their files and load millions of debit cards. They've warned it could take a week. And here's the kicker, there are only 2 major vendors in the entire country that process these EBT cards. Now, imagine every single state trying to push through a month's worth of benefits at the exact same time through that tiny bottleneck. It's like the entire country showing up at the same 2 ATMs. The system is going to choke. For millions of families, this means another week of stretching pasta, watering down milk, and visiting food banks that are already stretched to their absolute limit. The end of the shutdown doesn't mean food magically appears on the table tomorrow. And how about the engine of our economy, travel and commerce? Delta CEO, Ed Bastian, wasn't mincing words. He said the shutdown-related cancellations will hammer their quarterly earnings. Why? Because when you have fewer TSA agents and air traffic controllers, the whole system slows down. The FAA was forced to implement ground stops and flight restrictions at major hubs like Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson, Chicago's O'Hare, and LaGuardia. We're talking thousands of canceled flights, just as we head into the Thanksgiving travel season, the busiest and most profitable week of the year for airlines. They might get back to normal in time for the turkey, but the lost revenue from early November is a black hole in their balance sheets. Finally, for my finance professionals watching, let's talk about the most insidious damage of all, the data blackout. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they all went dark. This means for the entire month of October and half of November, we've been flying blind. No official jobs report. No consumer price index to measure inflation. No data on retail sales or industrial production. This isn't just an inconvenience. The Federal Reserve uses this data to make decisions on interest rates. Without the CPI and jobs numbers, how can they possibly make an informed decision at their December meeting? Are they supposed to guess? Throw a dart at a board? Investors, corporate planners, small business owners, everyone who makes decisions based on the health of the economy has been operating in a thick fog. It's economic malpractice on a national scale. The markets have been jittery, with the VIX, the so-called fear index, staying stubbornly elevated not because of a crash, but because of pure, manufactured uncertainty. The White House says the BLS will release a new calendar, but it's going to be a data dump. We'll get a flood of delayed, potentially skewed information that will be difficult to interpret. It's like getting 3 months of your mail delivered all at once. Good luck sorting the bills from the junk. So, if the shutdown was so damaging to the economy and to real people, why did it happen? And who actually won this political game of chicken? Let's break down the deal. The core of the fight was this: Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, saw an opportunity. They used the government funding deadline as leverage to force a vote on renewing the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. These subsidies help millions of people afford their health insurance premiums and were set to expire. Their strategy: no subsidies, no open government. Republicans, with Trump in the White House, said absolutely not. Trump has been vocal about wanting to replace the ACA, not prop it up. So, they stared at each other for 43 days while the country burned. So who blinked? The Democrats did. Specifically, a group of centrist Democrats. The article names 7 senators and 1 independent. We're talking about folks like Tim Kaine of Virginia, whose state is home to a massive number of federal workers who were screaming in his ear. The public pressure, the stories of hardship, the economic damage, it all became too much. They broke ranks and cut a deal. And what a deal it was. In exchange for abandoning their party's core demand and voting to reopen the government, they got a promise. A promise from Senate Republicans for a vote on the ACA subsidies by mid-December. Not a promise that the subsidies will be renewed. Not a promise that it will pass the Senate. Just a promise for a vote. And even if, by some miracle, it passes the Senate, Speaker Mike Johnson has explicitly refused to guarantee it will even see the light of day in the House. And even if it passes both, there's no guarantee President Trump, who reiterated again this week he wants to replace the system, would sign it. So, the Democrats held the entire U.S. economy hostage for 43 days and walked away with a pinky swear that might be worth less than the paper it's written on. This is why Speaker Johnson is walking around calling their strategy foolish and pointless. From his perspective, he's not wrong. They took a huge political risk and came away with a participation trophy. Meanwhile, President Trump gets to play the role of the statesman. He gets to sign the bill to reopen the government, ending the pain he helped prolong. He looks like the adult in the room, even though he was one of the main combatants. He didn't give in on the central policy demand, so he can tell his base he stood firm. It's a political masterclass in having your cake and eating it too. Now, for the most important part of this whole story. This isn't over. This isn't a solution. It's a pause button. The bill Trump signed is an interim funding package. It's a stopgap. It funds most of the government only through January 30th. That's right, folks. We're just 77 days away from doing this all over again. Mark your calendars. Get ready for Shutdown, the sequel. Now, the politicians aren't totally stupid. They did some clever things in this bill to lower the stakes for next time. They funded the Department of Agriculture, which handles SNAP benefits, through the entire fiscal year. They also funded Veterans Affairs and military construction. Why? Because they're taking the most sympathetic hostages off the table. Next time there's a shutdown fight, they won't have to answer questions about veterans not getting their benefits or hungry families. They've insulated themselves from the worst of the public outrage, making it easier and more politically palatable to shut the government down again in January over more abstract budget issues. It's a cynical and strategic move. And the Democratic Party is in disarray. Progressive groups are furious with the centrist senators who caved. They're calling for Schumer to step down. The infighting between the progressive and moderate wings of the party has been laid bare. They went into this fight as a united front and came out a fractured mess, which only strengthens the Republican negotiating position come January. So here's the final picture. We just endured a 43-day, self-inflicted economic wound that cost over $100 billion, caused immense hardship for millions of Americans, and sowed chaos in our financial markets. In return, we got a temporary truce that solves nothing and sets us up for another battle in less than 3 months. The underlying political disagreement over healthcare and government spending is completely unresolved. The Democrats look weak and divided. The Republicans, and especially Trump, get to claim a tactical victory. And the American people, the ones who actually pay the price for this dysfunction, are left holding the bag. This wasn't a crisis being solved. This was a demonstration of how broken our political process has become, where inflicting economic pain on your own country is considered a valid negotiating tactic. It was, in the end, a masterclass in economic self-sabotage, all for the sake of a political boxing match where the only real loser was the US economy itself. That's the real bottom line.